Intermediate school children in Thames is putting social studies into action and learning about communication at the same time. Form 2 pupils at Parawai School are making a videotape on the development of a nearby community with a colourful past. The project is being sponsored by an AHI conservation fund because it's a way of preserving local history. Marcia Fleming reports.
For the pupils of Parawai School, it's a day trip with a difference, taking their classroom studies into the field. They've been researching the history of settlement in the Kaueranga Valley. Now they're spending the day filming in various locations, recording that history with the help of a group of elderly folk who once lived in the valley. First stop on the journey is the old Kaueranga Hall, which in the early days served as a school as well as a community meeting place. So for the old people, it's a chance to share memories and renew acquaintances.
We're trying to conserve the history of the forestry, the history of the bushmen, the gum diggers, the people who lived up here in the past. Some of these people were farming in the flat areas, others were working way up in the bush areas up here, and a lot of these people have either forgetting or they've passed away, and we're losing it for Thames.
What do you think the kids are gaining out of being involved with the old times, if you like, in this way?
It's made them realise the changes that have occurred and the different values I think older people have. Some of those still carrying on today, some that have changed.
Today it's a quiet farming community, but there are still reminders of what the valley looked like in its heyday.
From the top of the hill up there you can see the cutting going through the rock formation.
Transportation was difficult in the rugged central Coromandel ranges, and ingenious methods were developed to provide access. At one time, a tram line ran the length of the valley, a sort of narrow railway track over which bush locomotives could haul timber from the logging operations. The tram line was a remarkable piece of work, bridging rivers and climbing steep ridges to get the timber through. The valley enjoyed a boom time from 1870 to the 1920s, and the bush camps flourished. The school children are using old photos like these as part of their videotaped history, looking at the early settlers, their work and their way of life. At one time, the valley had its own pub. On location, the class continues filming as tales are told of the wild old days.
One other bit.
What?
Some of the old bushmen that had been back in the bush for several months, they'd get out as far as here with a big fat load of money aboard, and they'd get as far as the pub. They'd give the money to the publican, and they'd say, well, tell us when she's cut, mate. Might be 2, 3 days, might last 4 or 5 days, and when it was cut, he'd point them back to the head of the Kaueranga, and that would be it. That's as close to Thames as they'd get. They weren't all drunkards. This was just some of them we're talking about. The good, clean-living blokes like us you never hear about.
For the children, it's a chance to see at first hand the natural resources of their area, how they were used in the past, and what still exists.
Well, we get to know who lived up the Kaueranga, and it is a part of our area, and it's just very interesting to know what happened.
How do you describe what you think life would have been like for the people living up in the valley way back then?
Extremely hard, but they didn't seem to mind really.
Why do you think that was?
They had to put up with it, so they just got on with life. And
made the best of it that they could. What were some of the more interesting things that you've learnt so far since you've been doing this project?
About the water race, the way the shanties were built.
Do you think it was good engineering that they had back then?
I think they use their brains more than they do today.
Filming's almost finished, but there's still a lot of work before the videotape will be ready for screening. It will be available for public viewing, and the school is planning several more projects of this kind as a means of preserving local history. Marcia Fleming for the Video Dispatch.
They might let us have a look at it on Video Dispatch.
Documentary, we have gathered information that will soon slip away from our grasp. We have discovered the reasons why people chose to live in the Kaueranga Valley, why and how those people made their living in the valley. Drawn here for work or maybe for pleasure, as bushmen or farmers, picnickers or hunters, trying to make a living or have a good time. Our settlement and lifestyle has changed, and much of the valley is overgrown, so that we can hardly imagine that anything could have lived in those certain places.
The hilly area was where the bushworkers lived in camps. Most were there only temporarily, whereas the flat land was where the settlers chose to make their farms and orchards. In making this video, we have tried to capture a collection of aging memories from those who are and were connected with the Kaueranga Valley.
Early settlement involves the era of 1800 to 1900. During that time there were many hardships. People urgently needed jobs and hoped they would find them in the Kaueranga Valley. Some had big families to support and had to work very long, hard hours. On the 28th of November 1870, Mr. John Lee Stevens bought 18 acres from a Mr. Goodall at the Kaueranga Creek. On the 27th of March 1873, he purchased another 2 acres adjoining the land he already owned. As you can see, it's shaded in. At this time, they were living in the Parawai area. By 1878, they were living at the Kaueranga Creek. In 1881, he owned 75 acres in the Kaueranga Valley and was farming it. One of his grandchildren was drowned at the well-known Horseshoe Bend near the old site of the Kaueranga Hotel.
This photo shows the orphanage at the top of what is now Smith's Farm. The orphanage opened in 1878. It was owned by the Thames Council and boarded for about 50 to 100 children at once. It was finally closed because Thames' population dropped dramatically after the gold rush. Mr. Smith is pointing out the lilies which were grown outside the orphanage over a century ago. When the orphanage was dismantled, some of the old windows and framework were built in with Mr. Smith's present home. In this picture, it shows some equipment the gum diggers used in their heyday.
Gum diggers were also a part of early settlement coming from as far away as Dalmatia. They came to earn a living. The Kauri gum was used for making linos and varnishes. The buyers had the gum weighed on scales and paid the diggers about $1 a pound.
There were a couple of miners mining by the Hihi. If it hadn't been for the bushworkers, there wouldn't have been any jobs up the Kaueranga. There was a few bush camps in which the bushworkers lived in. In 1821, the oldest house in the valley was built. This was Ware's house. It is now situated opposite the Christian camp. This picture shows Hawkins' house situated now where the Wainoa camping ground is.
Is where the quarry was sited. It was called the Blue Metal Quarry, and Mr. Stevens owned the quarry. He also owned a house where he lived next to the quarry. Mr. Stevens owned 75 acres in the Kaueranga Valley. The Blue Metal Quarry stood for the rock that they found in the quarry. The quarry was closed in the 1970s. The new owner of the land now are the Dohertys.
Here's a picture of the quarry.
The bakehouse was owned by Mr. J. Granville. He and his parents made bread for the Kaueranga Valley settlers. They carried the bread by horseback to various places up and around the Kaueranga. This was opened at this site in the year 1917. In the 1950s, the mail delivery started. The post office was near the swing bridge.
This is a picture of the post office picnic. It was a picnic for the post office staff members and family. A quick, cool, fun swim was involved.
The majority of children at the orphanage were there because of mining accidents which involved their parents. Some were there because of natural disasters such as floods. Others were there because their parents were unable to support them.
This house was built from bits of the old orphanage.
This swing bridge was used to get across the orphanage and for the mail delivery. Left is Mr. Smith's mother and Mrs. Pike and Mrs. Granville. This is a swing bridge that used to run over to the orphanage, which was up in the background. This is where the orphanage was sited. The children were of all ages, ranging from the young ones to the teenagers. A child would be very lucky to be adopted in less than 2 or 3 years. The orphanage was there in the 1980s and it closed in the 1900s. This is where the creamery was. It supplied cream, milk, cheese and butter. It is now the Christian camp. This is the Kaueranga Hall. The Kaueranga Hall was used for dances.
Around the candle and with the wax on the wall, and then someone would sit on a chaff sack, and then another person would pull them around, get the floor nice and shiny, and the bushman would come down from the bush and have a jolly good evening, and then we just joined in the fun that way.
The Swindle Swing Bridge was dismantled in 1908. The swing bridge was a way to get in and out of bush and gum diggers' camps. The swing bridge was closed down because logs jamming during the drive. The remains of the bridge is near the forestry headquarters. There was also a store near the area. Across the swing bridge was a slaughterhouse that supplied meat for the settlers, mainly for bush campers. Crossing the bridge was an access to the Tairoa Hikuai block. The Collins family had 2 stores, one in the Wainori area and the other in the Hihi tramline junction. They opened in the 1920s. Bert Collins and his family looked after them. One of the Collins brothers, Tudor Collins, was well known for his photos that were taken up the Kaueranga. At this time, Mrs. E.D. Collins rode a pack horse up and around camps carrying supplies from the stores. They sold boots, trousers, socks, tobacco, etc. to the bushmen and the gum diggers. Goods were brought in by both pack horse and tramline bogies. This is just part of the Kaueranga Valley transmission line that runs from the foot of the Kaueranga Valley to Whitianga. The transmission line provided work for the workers who built the line. It also supplies electricity for the Kaueranga Valley up to Whitianga.
A lot of people moved to the Kaueranga Valley to make a living out of farming. Ian Smith took over the farm from his father in 1950.
Farms consisted of cows, sheep and pigs.
Smith had a lot of horticulture, for instance apples, apricots, plums and peaches.
It was used on the place for the cartage of cream. I don't know what was used before this to take it to a creamery by the Christian camp. You took the milk there and they processed it. The separators came into vogue, and our cream then went to Parawai.
Machinery was horse-drawn. Horses played a major part in transport.
This is one of the last Clydesdales to be found in the Kaueranga Valley. Belongs to Mr. Smith.
Oh yes.
It's a grain shredder.
Driven, and the sheaves of oats went in here. Now you can see the little sprockets afterwards that took it in, and then it was cut with these with these knives.
Mrs. Rusich's parents came from Yugoslavia. They owned an orchard opposite the Christian camp. Vodkovich's also came from Yugoslavia. Mr. Vodkovich was contracted to build bridges for the bushmen, but when all the bush had been cleared away, he bought this piece of land in the Kaueranga. This is the orchard he owned.
Very bad flood, which my father was a winemaker, and it flattened all the grapes, and orchards. A lot of apricot trees were ruined, but we survived it.
Photo shows boxes pushed up against the fence during the flood.
This is Mr. Vodkovich ploughing the field with horsey and plough. In 1947, the tractor replaced the horse.
Mr. Stan Devsich has lived in the Kaueranga Valley since he was a little boy. In the 1920s, there's a lot of activity with all the bushworkers in the valley.
Shoulders, right, and then for the cart, spring cart, you use this saddle, and the shafts would go through there, and then the reins would go through here. Right, that's it. That's for the spring cart. Now the dray, there's another one there for a very light gig. Now you have two horses in, and the reason why it's a hillside, so you can, when you're doing a slope on the hill, but you go backwards and forwards in the same slope. So when you get to the end of the run, you just kick that over there, lift that up, so the horse swings around, and you swing your horses around like that, and then you go, and when you get to the end of the you just kick that over, up the bed. Click on there. There you go. If you get two well-trained horses, the only thing you've got to do with it, the horse is used to the furrow, he'll stay in the furrow. And the other one's here, and all you got to do is balance your plough.
Present day, Devsich's own 850 acres of land.
Many hundreds of bushworkers were drawn to the rugged Coromandel ranges of the Kaueranga Valley from around the world for what seemed a very prosperous life. They came mostly to fell karri trees, working for either the Karri Timber Company or for the Stone Brothers. They gave up their cosy city ways for the rough, hard life in the valley. They brought in small, uncomfortable shanties which were usually situated near a river or creek. Each shanty held 10 to 16 men and a cook, but if the cook was a lady, another building was built. The cook was often the most important person in the camp. A good cook cooked good food and kept the men happy on the job. With anything up to 30 men to feed, the bush camp cook worked long and hard and daily made many loaves of bread in the camp ovens. Mrs. Edie Collins brought supplies up to the camps on pack horse. Each pack horse carried a 25 kilogram sack on either side and 8 kilogram on the saddle.
They call the staircase. Now this staircase was traversed up the hill side of the valley, and it was steps cut into the Papa Rock by pack horses. Years their groceries and stuff packed in by pack horse. These pack horses would be perhaps a train of 7 or 8 of them, and they'd go stamping up this side of this hill, up this track, until eventually they wore these steps.
To bush to work, they had no shelter, so they had to build themselves temporary shelter, often called a mai-mai, as often was called duck shooters build a mai-mai. Well, this is a glorified mai-mai, and it was built mostly out of nikau. You're familiar with the nikau palm, and the nikau was platted, and very temporary cooking facilities were used. And they lived in that while they prepared the main shin shanty, and you notice that it is totally built out of karri palings. They did this by falling some of the handy trees and cross-cutting them into lengths and splitting them into karri palings. And the whole thing was built out of timber from the bush around there. The frame was made out of poles, and the main ridge pole across the centre would be probably a karri reka or a tanakaha reka, and then poles were placed along underneath it, the palings nailed on top of them. You notice that your chimney is also made out of the same material, made out of karri palings. You might think that being wood, it's a wonder that it didn't catch fire. It was just so huge. Almost, you might say it was like a room with a opening along the top to let the smoke out. And quite often they had seats along each side where the bushmen used to sit at night, and they used to hang their clothes up there to dry. And there were always never less than 1 or 2 big pots or camp ovens with the water boiling in them, and sometimes with a stew cooking and this sort of thing. Now, to give you an idea of what I was talking about, there are the poles in the roof. You can't quite see the ridge pole, but they went up onto a ridge pole, and then you can see the battens that the karri palings were nailed onto. And this is inside the chimney, inside the room, looking towards the chimney at the far end. Here you see the table. There are the forms which the bushmen sat on. There's some of the utensils out for their meal. And in here are their bunks where they slept, and another tier above. It was customary, as Mr. Lack said, to have, well, you'd build a shanty according to the number of people, 12, 14, 16. The most I've been in was a 14-man camp. And we might wonder what all this is hanging up there. That's mosquito netting. It's to keep the mosquitoes from eating you alive in the bush. It was a 10-hour day. You wanted a good night's sleep. About the chimney in the far end. Well, we're looking right into the chimney, and there are the big pots hanging. They're on a crossbar here. And where you have a thermostat on today's electric stove to adjust your heat, so we had a chain with hooks in it. And we adjusted our heat by, well, 2 ways, I suppose, really. Lifting the pot up and down on the chain, or building the fire up more or less. These ones are out in the front here, keeping food warm. And there you, now we've ruined it. Okay. There you see some of what the cookers got ready to go back on. You can't see any seats in this one. I think we might be able to see clothes drying here. Certainly we can see it up there. You hung your clothes wherever you could to get them dry, because there were very few wet days in the bush, and a bit of smoke didn't matter very much.
The bushworkers worked long, hard hours, sometimes up to 13 hours a day. They usually woke at 6 every morning and went to bed about 8 or 9 at night. They had no luxuries like we have today, so for entertainment at night and on weekends they played cards, but they never gambled. They often played cards on a buckley. A buckley was when it was raining too much and they had to stay indoors. They also wrestled, which was quite a popular sport in bush camps. Buckleys were quite rare and the bushmen looked forward to them.
Bushworkers went and felled mostly karri trees. In the late 1920s, the valley was swarming with bushworkers. There were over 200 workers in over 20 camps. This photo shows George Murray's 2 sons beside the 2 largest logs brought out of the valley in 1918 to 1928 operations. The tree had been
tree was cut off and discarded. Then the trunk was cut into manageable sizes and transported out by bullock, steam hauls or log chutes. Were used, they were yoked together in pairs and used as a team to haul the logs out from where they were felled down to the driving creeks. Later in the 1918 to 1928 operations, bullocks were rarely used because steam haulers had taken over most of their work. When steam haulers did take over, the logs were hauled out to the river or the tramline. This could be used. Permanent log chutes were built to transport the logs down to the driving creeks. But once in the river, the logs were stopped at one of the hundreds of carry dams in the valley. It was built over almost every river. When the water was collected behind the dam, it was tripped. It sent a flood of water and the logs downstream. Log jams.
After a dam had been tripped, the logs would go to the main booms or go to the Whangatūringa booms. From here, the logs would be hauled to the Kaueranga tramline. Les and Bull Nankivell operated the Kaueranga tramline. The Kaueranga tramline was built in 1914 and later dismantled in 1928 at the end of the 1918-1928 operations. The 18-kilometre tramline went from Totra to the start of the Billygoat tramline. The Billygoat tramline started where the Kaueranga Road now ends.
In 1918, Mr. Vodkovich constructed a side lane up the Mangakuri and another one up the Hihi in 1922. And in 1923, another one was built in Puranui. Parts of the Kaueranga tramline are still partly visible after being uplifted for over 50 years. Some can be seen at the Hoffman's Pool and behind the Innskeep's house. The Kaueranga tramline was used during the operations of the Kari Timber Company, which spanned 60 years, from the 1870s to the 1920s.
Workers didn't work every day of the week. The short Saturday working day gave them time to do their washing and mending. On a Sunday, it was a bush workers' day off. They would go walking, hunting, visiting other camps, or attending to their tools. Sometimes they went to the Kaueranga Hotel and spent their week's pay.
Some of the old bushmen that had been back in the bush for several months, they'd get out as far as here with a big fat load of money aboard, and they'd get as far as the pub. They'd give the money to the publican, and they'd say, well, tell us when she's cut, mate. It might be 2, 3 days, might last 4 or 5 days, and when it was cut, he'd point them back to the head of the Kaueranga, and that would be it. That's as close to Thames as they'd get.
Mr. Leck is now almost one of a kind regarding Kaueranga Valley bushworkers. He is one out of about 5 left to be living.
Well, I was, for about 18 months, I was cross cutting, that's just felling the trees and cut them into long lengths.
Yeah.
And my stepfather was a contractor for the Billygoat tram. You been up to Kaueranga?
Yeah.
Well, we built the Billygoat tram, and I erected the bridges. So Tony drove the hauler. And I worked up at Webb's Creek. That's up that staircase, you know. You've seen the photo of the staircase, for the stone staircase the horses used to have to up them?
Oh, Mr. Fitzgerald.
Up down to Webb's Creek. Well, I worked up there.
Yeah.
I worked in the Hihi, at the top of the Hihi for Herman Lennon. And after the war, after World War II, we were back in the Kaueranga again with my friend here. And then the Mangarahu, that's where you get your water supply now.
Yeah.
These that Mr. Lack used to make. He's made dozens of these. The axe is only wood, all made out of wood, though it looks like steel. And the Carry Bushmen's Association, which we both belong to, and that's why that is put on there. These have been sent around all over the North Island anyway, I think even in the South Island. And this one is a baby Carry apple, always referred to by the Kauri Bushmen as an apple, but they are really, it really and truly is a Kauri pine cone. There's another one of the underhand chop. Now, if you watch the chopping on TV lately, you'll have seen them do it, where the bushman stands there and he does the chopping.
It rained so heavily that the river...
Miss Donnelly arrived in Thames in the 1920s. She with friends would go up the Kaueranga Valley for picnics on the loco. When the river was high, Miss Donnelly and company would ride across the river on the back of some bullocks. Les and Bill Nankerville drove the loco. The tramline started at Totra and finished at the end of the road, as it is today.
They would walk to the bottom of the Billygoat Falls, then get on to the bogey, and then they would get hauled to the top of the Billygoat. Whenever they got to the top of the tramline, there was always a cup of tea waiting for them. We went up mainly in January when Miss Donnelly's sister was home from the training college.
Here is the hauler at the top of the Billygoat where they visited. At the end of the day, Miss Donnelly and her friends would be transported back to Totra along the tramline. It would be a nice outing if it wasn't raining.
About a man who was coming out of the forest, and there used to be a hotel in the Kaueranga Valley where Mr. Despatch has a house now. And this man, he had a sugar bag, a heavy weight on his bag, and he dropped it down at the hotel door, and he went in to have a drink because I think he was ready for it, because he'd carried this heavy weight, and someone asked what he had in the bag, and he said, "My mother," and they thought that was a bit of a joke. And when they looked, sure enough, it was a dead person, a dead Maori in the bag, and they were trying to bring her down to the Taipari place, or marae, I suppose they would call it, before she was buried. And that was, my father used to tell us that quite often, that story about them.
Mr. Luxton visited the Kaueranga during the 1920s. When Mr. Luxton first visited the Kaueranga Valley, the Kaueranga Timber Company, or KTC, was getting the last of the kauri out of the valley. Mr. Luxton would arrive on a ferry at Burke Street Wharf and walk up through the Kaueranga to Tairua.
Is all right?
Yeah.
Mr. Woods visited the Kaueranga in the late 1920s. He visited his grandparents in the Mangarehu on weekends.
Here he is telling us about the Depression years.
Half the style of what it is now, only we weren't catered for like people are. In the early 30s, the late 29s, the 30s was a coalition government, and that went for 4 years. The foundries and everything was all shut down. There was no work. I think there was 80,000 people. In those days, places you're referring to now up at the head of the Kaueranga, that was just swarming with gum diggers. There was, I think one part was over 100 gum diggers. Well, they would utilise the old empty camps belonging to the Kauri Timber Company.
The forestry took over the Kaueranga Valley bush area in the 1940s with the planting of many young pines. There have been many nature tramping and walking tracks opened in the past 40 years of servicing the valley. Also, there are 3 swing bridges.
Wainora, once a very busy area of the past, now has been transformed into camping grounds. The forestry needs to maintain these camping grounds regularly for the public who use them.
Started up the Kaueranga, my mate and I.
For a 9-year period, Mr. Leslie worked up the Kaueranga Valley. He had 6 men employed.
Out thinnings from the pines, from the Mangarehu. We had to put all our own roads in. What road there was there went straight up the centre of the valley, and it was just, yeah, so in the wet weather we used to have a lot of fun trying to get out, get stuck and all sorts of things. But the worst patches, we used to take a load of stones up in the morning when we went and fill all the potholes and bad places and that. We had 7 crossings over the creek as we went to get up to where we were working the thinnings.
Whereabouts did you live?
I didn't live up the Kaueranga, I lived here, right here.
During the 1960s, Mr. Bateman and Mr. Sam Despatch organised woodchopping carnivals, which were held twice a year on New Year's Day and Easter at Parawai Racecourse, along with other activities.
Intensive funding in the Thames and Thames Valley area, from rappels and house-to-house collections, the Kaueranga Education Camp opened on the 10th of January 1979, near the end of the road. Now controlled by the Kaueranga Forest Education Camp Society Incorporated. It supplied camps for people all around New Zealand.
Parawai Primary School was opened in 1967 and now serves the children of the Kaueranga Valley.
Land behind the forestry headquarters, which is now tripped on Sundays at 4 o'clock at holiday time.
After seeing this documentary, we hope you have realised that the people in this video were hard-working and lived life in a way that we could never experience. The Kaueranga is a memorable place created by the bushworkers, the settlers and the visitors. It is now a place for holiday makers, present residents and relics of the past. We hope that you have enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Memories, a Bushman's Poem by T.W. Scott. I remember the floods in the Kaueranga since 1883, when I took to the bush with my bluey to earn my LSD. 10 hours per day, 6 days per week, all for £1 to pull on the end of a 10-foot saw and get the carry down, to trip the dams in flood time and drive the timber out, to build the chutes and jack the logs and general rows about. I remember the easterly gales with rain when the floods rose up so high, and the distant roll of thunder as the logs went floating by. I've worked from the booms to Rangihow, from Reds Creek to the waterfall, from the hee across the dancing camp, the roughest of them all. I've helped to float the logs right through, from the booms to Shortland Mill, with my old workmates. Some are gone, some are living still. I remember the wintry daybreak, when you woke to the sound of the horn. The trees were big and lofty, and the days were 10 hours long. I also remember the climbs up creek and mountainside, to where the giant carry stood in all his glory and pride. With a saw and axe we hacked him down, and with a crash he fell. Another monarch here laid low, I know the spot so well. I've watched the trees go crashing down to 1,000 feet below, where bullocks hauled the timber out, a process sure but slow. It seemed to me but a few short years, and all have gone I fear, the good old bushman and the carry, how soon it all disappear. The greatest tree on all earth is destroyed by man's rough hand. No other tree can take its place in this, our native land.